Hey, Donna, it's so good to see you, and thanks for being willing to do this interview and testimony of your life in Burundi. I think it's about 20 years since you and I first met, when
Yes.
God has spoken to me about what became ACT Together, and he had spoken to you while you were still in Burundi about hope for tomorrow. And we found how our visions came together in a remarkable way. And we had the joy of working quite closely together for 4 or 5 years, but have kept close friendship since then. Just give me a little bit background of what first took you to Burundi and what you were doing there.
Yeah, so I mean, in a nutshell, I was a teacher and had a real sense of call to the nations, but didn't really know what that looked like. And actually, it was at the Stoneleigh Bible Week when I met a lady called Chrissy Chapman, British lady working in Burundi, who was taking in orphan children and was starting up a school, and invited me initially to go and teach those children. And so I first went to Burundi in 1999, and then found actually that she said that we were to set up an international school, and that I was the person to do it. And I remember thinking, God, you got me here under false pretenses. I don't know how to do this. But anyway, my ticket was booked for many months ahead. And so there I stayed, and there began my journey of beginning to lean on God in a whole new way.
And what was the situation in Burundi at that time?
So at that time, there was civil war in Burundi, a tribal conflict. So yeah, a very broken nation. There's a history of tribal conflict in Burundi, and political conflict. So yeah, it was very sobering days when you knew that there were many kind of massacres going on around the country, and just horrific things happening, incredible poverty and hardship on just about every level, really. So
And of course,
yeah.
Christy had started an orphanage, hadn't she, for essentially
Yeah.
children out of that conflict whose parents had been massacred. Yeah.
And orphaned through other things as well. But yeah, so no, she had around 50 children that she'd taken in, mostly actually who'd come in as babies, and then obviously had grown up, and hence the need for a school to start. So yeah, she was doing an amazing job. So
And one of those, I think, was Mutungwa, who I'm sure his name will come up a bit later as well. So just tell us a little bit about Mutungwa then, and your relationship with him over the intervening time.
yeah, so I first met Mutungwa when he was about 8 years old, and he had just been orphaned. He'd come down to the city from the rural areas with his younger brother, who sadly died, and then his mum died in hospital. And Mutungwa didn't know where he'd come from, didn't know the name of his kind of home village at that point, and so was found just sleeping rough in the hospital after his mum had died. By the husband of one of our team at the orphanage, and was taken in. And so I met him soon after that, when I arrived in Burundi. And to cut a very long story short, really, reconnected with Mutungwa many years after I'd left. I was in Burundi, lived in Burundi for 3 years, then came and worked with you, and then ended up coming back to Burundi, and reconnected with Mutungwa as a young adult. And there's just a real sense that God has made us family, actually, and he now sees me as a mum. I see him as a son, very much so. And he's now one of our key leaders in the work that we're doing here. So God's really raised him up and had his hand on him. It's been remarkable, really, and how God kind of just intertwined our paths for his for his purposes. It's been amazing.
And in that time, he completed his schooling, went to university, came back to Burundi, and is now working closely.
Yeah, I did some training in the UK for a year, and then went off to university, and then God called him back to his own nation. He was a refugee for a couple of years in Rwanda, and then came back here about 4 or 5 years ago, when there was then a new kind of crisis here in the nation, more of a political crisis. And in the midst of the challenges, he came right back into that, and now as I say, really is our key leader here. It's amazing, really, how God's purposes have prevailed.
I think it's about 10 years ago, if I remember rightly, that you felt God called you back to Burundi.
That's right.
How did that happen, and how did he speak to you? What was the vision that he gave you?
Well, when I first lived here, when I was here doing the school, God spoke to me in 2000 and gave me a vision that I call Hope for Tomorrow, and it was basically a vision of the kind of a practical demonstration of the Father heart of God for the poor and the marginalized. But I felt God spoke to me about reaching people practically, so through education, care of orphans, agriculture, water. It was a very vast vision, but the thrust of it really being that God wanted people to have hope and to know Him in very real ways. And God had put this vision in my heart. It wasn't just for Burundi, and part of that was to plant churches and really just to see the kingdom come, to see a wide breadth of transformation, seeing the rule and reign of God coming in all areas of society, really. And so I was living with that vision from the year 2000, and had got very excited after I felt God spoke to me, but had felt God said, no, just do nothing other than pray. And then obviously came back to the UK, unexpectedly, wasn't planning that, but God brought me back for a few years, worked with yourself and running short-term mission teams, and then ended up working in Zimbabwe, and actually thought that I was going to be moving to Zimbabwe. And circumstances slowed that down. My dad was very sick, and eventually ended up dying. And in the midst of that, I just felt that God was saying to me, now was the time to start Hope for Tomorrow. And I didn't know what Hope for Tomorrow was at that point. I knew it wasn't about a charity. I believe that God's way is through the church, and I couldn't quite see what this meant. And so had many months of just, saying, well, God, I'll do whatever, but I don't really know what to do. And just this sense of, I felt God said to me, walk with Jesus, just look into the eyes of Jesus. Don't worry about what's behind him. Walk with Jesus, be filled with the Holy Spirit, and be faithful with the small. And so I thought, okay, well, let me just start to, give myself to the vision that I think God's put in my heart, and I'll just do whatever I can. And so it was quite a difficult time. Many people around were saying I'd gone crazy and what was I doing? But God broke into that really quite seemingly very randomly one day, and just said to me, go back to Burundi, like for a visit. I didn't feel he was saying go and live in Burundi. And it seemed really strange because, as I say, I'd been working in Zimbabwe, had thought that that was where I was going to end up. And God just really turned things around. So I spoke to my church leader at that time and said, what do you think? Am I crazy? He said, I often think you're crazy, but you do hear God. Why don't you go and see what God will do? So that was in 2010. And I basically, to cut a long story short, met a man who I'd worked with when I was first out here, called Everest, who shared with me a vision that God had given him for transformation. And he talked about transformation of people's hearts and transformation of the land, and took me up into his home village. And we stood on a mountain and looked out over the surrounding nations. And he just said, God has told me I'll see transformation wherever my eyes can see. And he said, but I don't know how to do it. And in that moment, I just thought, I feel like God had called me back to really just get behind him, to serve him. And I thought, we can link him up with people who can help him church plant and who can help him in this vision. And so I just thought, I'm gonna do what I can to serve him, which at that point was raising money for cows to bring people out of poverty. And then really over the numerous visits of coming in and out of Burundi, God kind of expanded things and opened things up, and kind of eventually ended up pointing us in a slightly different direction. But that's how it happened.
Just to explain to people who are watching this, the cows were to be more productive with milk than had formerly been the case with the traditional cow, wasn't it? And so you were providing people with income by selling the milk, good nutrition to the poor, etc. a very
That's it.
effective program. How did
Yeah.
you then, in due course, identify the community that you're now working with? How did that become about?
I mean, really, I can only say it was the hand of God. Everest had heard on the radio that there was a group of people living rough on a piece of land. They had been put there by the government, and they'd become known as the forgotten people. There was suspicion that many of them were rebels, and so nobody was really allowed to help them, and they weren't allowed to leave. So they were patrolled by armed guards and had nothing. I mean, literally were living under bits of cardboard. There was no sanitation, no water, no food. So actually some had literally starved because people were not allowed to assist. And Everest heard about them and just said, we must go. Let's go and see if we can and take food. So literally we just went to visit to see what we could do, and were absolutely horrified at the circumstances. It was worse than an animal farm, people in utter, I mean, hundreds and hundreds of people in utter despair. And yeah, we just, I think very quickly knew that God had called us just to do something. We didn't know what. We got permission to take some food. All ended up a bit messy. I won't go into that now, but it wasn't as straightforward as it sounded. But actually, God made a way for us to continue to go back. And so, monthly we would go in and we would take sacks of maize and beans for all of the families, and just start to share with them about Jesus, and which at that point, to be honest, was quite challenging because their circumstances were so horrific and there was such despair and hopelessness that it was one of those periods in my life where I really found myself questioning, God, are you who you say you are? Because if you are, things need to change for this community, because you know, if you love them, then they can't live like this. And you know, and then I began to really be challenged myself that we're the hands and feet of Jesus. You know, we're his body, we are image bearers, we get to represent him, we have that amazing privilege of representing him. And that actually the first thing was we just needed to love people. And so alongside taking in the food monthly, you know, we just go and be with people and just show them that they mattered, you know, and they were in despair. I mean, imagine, you know, you're called the forgotten people. It's just horrific. And we would go and share with them and say, you know, your name is engraved on the palm of God's hand, and he knows the number of hairs on your head, and speak to them from Psalm 113, you know, that talks about God's heart for the poor, you know, how he wants to lift them out of the dust and off the ash heap. And that was very literal, you know, they were living in the mud. And little by little, we just began to see God break in ways that were helping them. So we were able to provide milk for the children, and we put up shelters, put in some toilets, you know, just holes in the ground, but with kind of tent things around them, and trying to give some dignity and some very basic support, really. But the whole time, really, that you know, we could never meet all of the needs, we couldn't fix it, but really the thrust of, I think, what, you know, I really felt God was saying was just love people, you know, love them unconditionally. And, you know, they would hold on to my clothes, they'd be kind of ripping at, you know, saying, please help us. And like, well, you know, we just, what else can we do? Because we couldn't get them out of the camp. But that went on really for 4 years of just supporting that community. In the end, we put up just a kind of a tent and put a teacher in to kind of help, you know, teach the children. But I mean, it was hundreds of children with one teacher. It just all felt so inadequate. But amazingly, through that time, really, God just joined our hearts together and made us friends. And, you know, the people in that camp would say, you know, we know that you love us. And we would say, you know, we're in this together. Let us believe God that he is the one that can bring you out of this place of captivity, and he wants to lift you up. This is not his heart for you here, you know, in these dire conditions. And so yeah, would have to do a lot of kind of saying, you know, please don't look to my white skin, you know, which is very common. And, you know, we are so rich compared to so many, even if we don't feel like it. And so trying to not let that be a barrier, you know, that actually as a white person with means to resources, that you can solve the problems. It's like, no, God is our answer. We must look to him. And eventually the government actually destroyed the camp, and then the people were out of it. And then we had a whole new opportunity before us to work in a different way. But that's how it started. Sorry, long answer.
I mean, and I love the way that you then and ever since have talked about our friends in the camp. And you know, I know that's genuine. That's not just said. You know, I know that they are dear friends to you, and there are hundreds of them as well. I know that you mentioned the shortage of food, and that you felt that, you know, to help them become food self-sufficient was a goal, and that being down in Zimbabwe, you had learned something about the foundations for farming that had been developed through the church down there and with our dear mutual friend Brian Oldreeve. Can you just explain a little bit about Foundations for Farming, then tell us how you introduced that to this community?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, Foundations for Farming, as you say, pioneered in Zimbabwe by Brian Oldreeve, who really sought God for revelation on how to farm. And over a period of years, God spoke to him and showed him how he had designed things to work in nature. So Foundations for Farming seeks to basically mimic what God always intended, and so follows biblical principles and results in yields which are on average 10 times greater than an average yield would be in a nation, which is obviously phenomenal. But it's not just about a farming method. It's very much every lesson is looking at how God intended things to be. And so you teach about the nature of God and who God is, and then you're applying that to the land. And for many people, you know, it's how they, in our community, it's how many have been saved, and gives incredible opportunities to share the gospel. But you just have this really practical demonstration really of the kingdom coming in farming, you know, the rule and reign of God, learning to do things in his ways, and then just seeing these phenomenal results. And so, yeah, I'd worked with the team in Zimbabwe and had always been passionate about it. And so as soon as our friends were out of the camp, we're like, okay, now is the moment that we can actually start to train them in this way of farming, with the aim of, you know, them being able to feed themselves, but also, you know, giving us, as I say, the opportunity for people just to really meet with Jesus and to see the Bible coming to life. And, you know, even now people will say to us, I never knew the Bible talked about farming, really, you know, and yet they see it. And then of course, once they've seen it in one area of life, you know, then they're like, wow, God is real. You know, this is what happens with our crops when we do things in his way. So it's had a phenomenal impact here in Burundi, in the community that we're working with.
And it's really about kind of management of the soil, isn't it? And it's almost immaterial what the crop is. Obviously, maize is predominantly the staple diet in your part of Africa, but nevertheless, it's actually about the soil rather than the crop, isn't it? But Brian uses some little kind of key words, doesn't he, that demonstrate that it's almost a discipleship program on the vehicle of farming rather than just about the farming. Can you tell us about those?
The key principles. Yeah, so I mean, the key principles, doing things on time, at high standard, without wastage, and with joy. And, you know, actually, if you take those 4 principles and apply them to any area of life, you find actually they are transformational principles. And then alongside that, the huge emphasis on in Foundation for Farming is, you know, based on what the Bible says about faithfulness and learning to be faithful with the small, and then trusting God for increase. So those 4 principles, alongside the strong emphasis on be faithful with the small, be faithful with the small is is absolutely key to it and to its success, really, and brings about a transformation in people's mindset. So it's really not just a farming method, as you say. It is a way really of discipling people, and hearts and minds are changed, as well as the benefits to the soil and the land, which actually improves year on year on year with Foundations for Farming.
I think you said that you have opportunities to share the gospel in this context. Have you seen anyone saved, and how do you then kind of gather them as a community of believers?
Yeah, so I mean, we have used the opportunity of training people on our fields, and we gather for what we call field church. So we have a community of believers. We haven't been able to up until now gather on a Sunday for various reasons, but we have actually felt like we've kind of been in New Testament times as we've met on the side of the field. So we've worshipped together, we've prayed together, we've seen, I think in the last year or so, well over 100 people saved, just week by week by week, largely on the side of the fields. We've prayed for people, we've seen people healed, we've even had people delivered. In fact, there was one lady that that was healed, saved, delivered, and filled with the Holy Spirit all in one morning on the side of the field. And we were just all in awe, and you're like, wow, it's beginning to feel a bit like what we read about in the New Testament, where people really encountering Jesus and knowing that they've really encountered Jesus. She just looked different when she went home. She came, her eyes were dark, no hope, and then left, and she's now an amazing light in the community, really amazing.
Respond to the gospel just to sometimes call rice Christians just for the benefits. You go deep and you really disciple and build people up, and that these people are saved, that they're not just superficial Christians.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And we do our very best to follow up each one, really, and provide them with Bibles. Many actually can't read, so that's quite a challenge, but having to share the word of God with them and do that in kind of small group situations and help them to connect with one another, and just really teach them the very, very basics. So I mean, this is actually a very Christianized nation, but it's a very religious nation, and there's not historically really very much depth often to people's beliefs, and so the whole discipleship thing is particularly critical here, where many will there'll be many crusades and many will seemingly respond to the gospel, but then there's nothing afterwards. So we are doing our best in quite challenging circumstances to make sure that we really do that we really are faithful with those that God has given us, and that we see them through. So we have kind of discipleship sessions in different contexts, and we do a class for new believers and gather them in that context. But through Foundations for Farming, it's actually amazing how the opportunities present themselves for discipleship, even in terms of our people are working in groups. How do you handle conflict? What does the Bible say? So it's very, very practical. It's not so much a classroom exercise or even a theoretical exercise. It's very rooted in this is the challenge. What does the Bible say? What does Jesus say? What does it mean to follow Jesus in this situation? So.
And I know that, in a lot of the training that, you're not giving the training yourself, are you? It's not the YC coming in and teaching.
No.
You have trained trainers, haven't you, to bring that training, and also they themselves as leaders are being discipled and built up so that it's essentially an internal self-supporting community of believers
Yeah,
who are being empowered
absolutely.
and so on. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I feel really strongly about us white people can unwittingly come in and just be, we can think we've got the answers, we think we know how things should work, and it's so not true. I'm the only white person in our team, and I'm really in fact in our whole community. I'm really thankful for that, because the emphasis must always be really on the the local people. What do they believe about the situation that they're in? What do they think needs to happen? That we going in are there to serve, and there to demonstrate God. And it's no good us coming in and imposing our ideals. And I've made many mistakes over the years, and I just catch myself time and time again, and you're like, what about this? And then you're like, hang on a minute, that's from my culture, that's from my perspective, that wouldn't work here. And just really not wanting to impose, but to empower. And I think, again, that Psalm 113 is so key in terms of God's heart for the poor, that he lifts them up, he seats them with princes. They need to be treated with dignity and lifted up. We're not here to help. We do want to help, but the emphasis is actually on valuing people, loving people, introducing them to Jesus, as it were, and seeing his work in their lives, transforming them and lifting them up. And as much as possible, more and more, really, personally, I'm trying to take a back seat and kind of push the other guys forwards. And so actually, from that camp community that I was telling you about, 3 of our leadership team are now from that community. And the reality is, we couldn't have done anything that we've done if it had not been for them, because they're the ones that have corrected me along the way when I've said stupid stuff, and they've kind of very gently said, it's not how it works here, and there's this in our culture. And it's very, very important, I think, to be a listener and a learner, and humility, and just wanting to serve and see them lifted up. Really, I know that's some of the key things that God has taught me and continues to teach me on a weekly basis, if not a daily basis.
And maybe that's the appropriate place to bring this video to an end. There's so much more we could say, but a listener and a learner, and you still are. I mean, that's a wonderful message to get across to people who are considering their calling, wondering about moving out, maybe newly in a different location, to go on being a listener, to go on being a learner, to go on in humility. I think, have you got anything else you would add to that? But I think if people go away with that message, that's a good
I mean, I suppose the main thing that I would say really is, I think, in whatever nation we're in, whatever we're doing, in whatever context, that our focus needs to be our relationship with Jesus and intimacy with him, and I think it's out of that place of abiding that we are fruitful, when we're really filled with him and we learn to see things from his perspective and learn to kind of lay down our own ways. And that, I think, probably Proverbs 3, 5 and 6, do not lean on your own understanding, in all your ways acknowledge him and he will direct your paths. And I think that's been so true for me and for us here, that we don't have the answers, but God does, and he'll do it, and we just need to submit and to surrender to him.
That's a great place to finish. Thank you so much, Donna. I really appreciate talking to you and hearing the story. Bless you.
Thank you for chatting. Thanks a lot, Nigel. Bless you. Bye.
Bye.